The camp didn't explode, it went silent. Not a scream, not a gunshot, just silence. Everyone noticed it, no one explained it. But why did it begin with her? She received the order alone. No briefing, no explanation, only the command. It shouldn't have been her job, yet refusal was impossible. Guards moved strangely, avoiding her gaze, as if speaking could summon consequences. Some orders aren't meant to be understood, and she was about to follow one. The camp seemed alive, yet every movement felt rehearsed. Not a shout, not a laugh, not a cough, just motion without purpose. I stepped forward. My boots pressed against gravel that seemed to swallow sound. Each step echoed, but the echo was hollow, stretched in a way that made time itself feel uncertain. A sense of observation pressed down on me, though no eyes followed. It was as if the camp had remembered my arrival before I even set foot inside. I had orders, clear, impossible, unquestionable. Yet clarity did not bring comfort. Should I follow them? Could I refuse? And what did obedience cost in a place that spoke without words? Every face I met carried a story unspoken, a memory erased. Their eyes did not meet mine. If they did, a flicker of fear or warning appeared and vanished immediately. The silence was deliberate, almost ritualistic. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier. Expectation, judgment, threat. I knew I should feel fear in the usual ways, a shout, a slap, a threat, but the threat here was different. It was a pressure that did not announce itself, a weight that threaded into every thought. I asked myself, do I step forward as a healer or as a pawn? And yet the choice seemed irrelevant, as though the camp would decide for me regardless of my will. The corridors stretched longer than they should have. Each step seemed to take hours. The familiar architecture of the camp betrayed me, looping back in ways impossible yet undeniable. I noticed a chair moved slightly from its original place, though I had not touched it. A window left open when it had always been closed. The clock on the wall ticked, but the sound was offbeat, irregular. These small anomalies mounted like bricks pressing against my chest, until breathing itself felt like a labor. Every patient looked at me, yet not fully. Their gaze was like water, reflective, shifting, never landing. Staff worked mechanically, obeying rituals I did not understand. Not one word was spoken to me, not one glance held. I tried to speak. My voice felt swallowed before it could form sound. And in that silence, the weight of responsibility grew heavier than any order. I was here to heal, yet my presence seemed to warp everything it touched. Every action was questioned by the unseen. Every movement weighed against rules I could not know. Do I act or do I wait? Every instinct screamed to heal. Every command compelled obedience. But obedience here is not guidance, it is a labyrinth. Each decision carries weight beyond understanding, consequences that cannot be predicted. I am a healer, yet my healing feels tainted by the unseen eyes that follow every thought. To act is to risk something. To refrain is to betray something else. The moral compass offered no direction, only tension, thick and unyielding. And so I moved forward slowly, carefully, knowing each step was both necessary and forbidden. The first signs were almost imperceptible, a shift in the rhythm of the camp that no one spoke of, that no one acknowledged. Meals were served slightly later than usual, the clatter of trays oddly muffled, as though the sound itself had decided to retreat. Guards who once moved with rigid precision now hesitated, pausing mid-step before resuming their patrols. Their eyes flicked in random directions, avoiding the obvious yet betraying a silent awareness of something just beyond comprehension. I walked past them, my presence acknowledged in the smallest of ways, a pause, a glance that lingered a fraction too long, a cough cut short. And yet they never spoke, never explained. It was as if the camp itself had taken on a life, an intention that I could sense but could not name. Every corridor seemed to have changed overnight. The familiar turned strange. A door that had always opened smoothly now stuck slightly on its hinges. The walls seemed closer, the shadows longer. Nothing violent, nothing overt, only subtle, unsettling deviations from expectation. I began noticing small anomalies that compounded into unease. A chair shifted slightly from where I remembered it the day before. A medical tray left in a corner yesterday had moved, though no one had touched it. Papers were stacked unevenly, not enough to be careless, but enough to feel deliberate. I touched one sheet and felt a strange resistance, as if the camp itself were subtly redirecting my actions. Each small irregularity pressed against the edges of my mind, creating a sense of wrongness I could not name. The staff around me behaved the same. Nurses moved with mechanical precision, soldiers completed their tasks with the same motions but with an unfamiliar stiffness. The routine of the camp, once comforting in its predictability, had fractured, and yet no one acknowledged it. When I looked at the clock in the hallway, the hands seemed to hesitate, as if caught between moments. Time itself had become elastic, stretching in ways my mind could not reconcile. I began walking more deliberately, measuring each step, counting the seconds between movements, but counting did not help. The corridor extended beyond what should have been possible. Familiar doorways appeared in new places. Shadows stretched differently. There were gaps in my memory, fleeting moments I could not place. I would enter a room I was certain I had passed 10 steps ago, only to find it slightly altered. Everything felt familiar and nothing felt real. Conversations around me faltered. Words cut off mid-sentence. Staff would stop speaking and glance away, their faces blank, betraying no recognition that I had heard them at all. I tried to engage, asking questions softly, observing carefully, but my voice seemed swallowed by the air itself. The camp had developed a rhythm, a pattern I could not match. I became acutely aware of my own presence, my own breathing, as if every inhale and exhale were being weighed, judged, and measured by forces I could not see. Even the light seemed wrong. Windows that had always streamed a certain clarity now cast shadows that lingered, curving around corners like liquid. A beam of sunlight through a crack seemed to move slower than it should, lingering on the floor before fading. The familiar became alien, and the alien became threatening in its silence. Each step forward felt both necessary and wrong, as though I were walking in a dream whose rules I had never been taught. I noticed other things, small but impossible. A tray I had carried the day before appeared in a completely different location. A needle left on a table seemed to shimmer unnaturally. I questioned my own perception, wondering if exhaustion or imagination had begun to distort reality. But no, there was something else here, something deliberate in the subtle chaos, something that made the camp feel alive in ways it had never been. I tried to speak to the staff, to ask questions, to establish some ground of reality, but their answers were minimal, clipped, lacking substance. They moved, performed, and then vanished from my line of sight. Faces would emerge in doorways, then dissolve as though they had never been there. The more I searched for explanation, the less I understood. I became hyper-aware of my own senses. Every step, every sound, every shadow held meaning, or at least the suggestion of it. A sudden shuffle behind me made my heart leap, only for nothing to appear. A flicker of movement in a doorway suggested someone watching, only to reveal empty space. I began to feel trapped in a world that obeyed no logic, where nothing could be counted on, and everything demanded attention. Time itself began to distort further. Meals came later, clocks hesitated, and sunlight lingered unnaturally long in the corridors. Tasks I had completed earlier appeared undone. Items I had touched returned to their original positions. The camp was subtly rewriting itself around me, folding familiar spaces into unfamiliar shapes. My mind strained to keep track, but the fractures multiplied faster than I could comprehend. Even the simplest gestures carried weight. A tray set down incorrectly, a door left open too long, a glance that lingered, each seemed to echo in the air, bouncing back to me in subtle, haunting ways. I could not decide if I was imagining it or if the camp itself was observing, testing, waiting. The line between reality and perception blurred, and I became intensely conscious of every thought, every hesitation. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps I was fatigued. Perhaps it was the weight of my duties, the isolation, the unnatural stillness that followed me. But the anomalies persisted, and their persistence carried an air of intention, of consciousness, of purpose I could not name. I felt both scrutinized and invisible, present yet erased. And in that subtle distortion, in that quiet fracture of the familiar, I realized something fundamental. The camp had shifted. It was no longer simply a collection of buildings and people. It was an organism, alive in ways I could not understand, responding to my presence, bending reality, manipulating perception. Every routine I had relied on was broken. Every expectation was betrayed. Every step I took carried unseen consequence. I moved forward with caution, trying to memorize the anomalies, trying to map them in my mind. But each observation was fleeting. Each memory shifted. Doors, chairs, trays, faces, they all betrayed me, changing ever so slightly each time I looked away. The camp had become a labyrinth, not of walls and fences, but of perception itself. And in that realization, the first seed of terror took root. Not the terror of physical harm, not the terror of punishment, but the terror of disorientation, of erasure, of a world where nothing could be trusted, where even one's own senses could not be relied upon. The camp was breaking me, slowly, imperceptibly, with the quiet persistence of things that will not announce themselves. The strange fractures in the camp grew more insistent with each passing hour. It was no longer subtle. The anomalies were no longer small deviations from expectation. They were accumulating, layering upon one another like sediment, slowly reshaping the reality around me. Doors that had previously opened with a faint resistance now refused entirely, or swung open with an unnatural swiftness, as though obeying an unseen will. I would pass a window, certain of what lay beyond it, and yet the view would be subtly wrong. A tree slightly shifted, a shadow in the distance lingering where it had never been, a figure that moved, then vanished, leaving no trace of presence. Time began to betray me. Minutes stretched into long, uncountable segments, and the sequence of events no longer followed logic. I would finish one task, only to discover that it had been completed before I began. Meals were served and consumed in irregular sequences, trays appearing and disappearing as if by memory, yet untouched by human hands. Conversations that I overheard were out of order, snatches of words spoken before the moment had arrived in reality, leaving my mind scrambling to orient itself. I tried to anchor myself in the routine, but the routine itself had become unreliable. Staff moved in their usual patterns, yet they repeated gestures, actions, and steps as if caught in a loop I could not penetrate. A nurse would lift a tray to a patient, then place it back in the same spot 5 minutes later, though the patient had not touched it. Soldiers would march in formation, and the formation would subtly shift, then reset to its previous arrangement with no apparent reason. The smallest gestures carried a weight of impossibility, each one teasing my perception, daring me to trust my own memory. Every space began to feel disconnected from linear time. A corridor I had entered 10 steps ago suddenly stretched farther than it should have. A room I had checked for supplies was now filled with unfamiliar objects in familiar places. Objects moved not by human hands, but by some intangible rule, some invisible architect shaping the environment to maintain an unyielding sense of wrongness. I touched a tray, then turned to leave, and when I looked back, the tray had already moved slightly, as if refusing my ownership, defying the logic of space and causality. The people in the camp became less consistent, more like echoes of themselves than living individuals. Words were spoken before the thought had formed, gestures were completed before anyone had initiated them, and smiles appeared fleetingly, never fully manifesting, vanishing as if the consciousness behind them was elsewhere. Each interaction, no matter how brief or mundane, carried the unsettling sense that I was both present and irrelevant, observed yet erased, like a ghost navigating a space that had decided I did not belong. I began to notice repeated patterns emerging from the chaos, tiny, subtle repetitions that were too precise to be coincidental. A shadow would fall across the floor in the same way at different hours. A tray would shift slightly to the left every day at the same moment. The same soldier would pass me 3 times in an hour, each time in perfect symmetry, moving without acknowledgement yet leaving a mark on my perception, as if reality itself had chosen to mirror my path. The camp was no longer a place of rooms and people. It had become a chronological puzzle, a landscape where cause and effect no longer aligned. I would hear laughter before it had been made, footsteps echoing in hallways I had not yet entered, conversations spoken in reverse. My mind strained to reconstruct a linear sequence, to find cause, effect, and meaning, but the thread slipped through my fingers, replaced by a sense of mounting dread and incomprehensible order. Even the physical sensations of the camp became unreliable. A door I had grasped firmly felt loose in my hand the next moment. Steps that should have produced sound were swallowed into silence, while silent spaces hummed with subtle vibrations I could not locate. Temperature shifted unexpectedly, a cold draft in a room that had been warm a second before, a heat that rose in a space that should have been empty. My senses betrayed me, or perhaps revealed the truth. The camp was no longer a static space, but a fluid organism, moving around me according to rules I could not perceive. I tried to speak to the staff, to ground myself in the reality of human presence, but communication failed. Words I had spoken came back to me in disjointed fragments, misunderstood, ignored, or seemingly uttered before I formed them. A question posed aloud would sometimes elicit an answer before it had even been asked. When I attempted to chart these patterns, to make sense of them, the very paper and ink shifted, leaving my observations incomplete, rearranged, or vanished entirely. The camp seemed intent on erasing my attempts to comprehend it, leaving only the residue of confusion and mounting anxiety. The patients contributed to the accumulation of disorder as well. They moved in subtle, impossible ways. A bedridden man would appear in one room, then moments later in another with no explanation, his breathing calm as if he had never been relocated. Others whispered words I had not heard, their voices repeating themselves across space and time. And yet when I approached, seeking clarity, their expressions blanked, their lips sealed. I began to feel the oppressive sense that my every effort to understand or intervene was anticipated, neutralized, and returned as incomprehensible chaos. The sensation of being trapped in this temporal disorder was overwhelming. I could no longer trust my memory, my judgment, or even my senses. Steps were retraced before they were taken. Conversations echoed before being spoken. Meals were eaten in sequences that defied logic. Objects moved independently, as if guided by some unseen hand. I felt my mind straining, trying to map a reality that had fractured into countless, overlapping layers. Each attempt to regain control only deepened the disorientation. Despite the mounting confusion, I continued my rounds. I cleaned, I tended, I observed, but the act of doing so no longer felt meaningful. Every intervention was met with the subtle, silent correction of the camp itself. A tray placed in one spot would subtly shift, a chair aligned perfectly one moment and skewed the next. My every gesture, my every thought, seemed absorbed, altered, and returned in a form slightly askew, teasing my perception, questioning my competence, and eroding my certainty. I began to wonder if I was imagining the accumulation of anomalies, if fatigue or fear had distorted my perception. But the evidence was undeniable. Time was inconsistent, space was malleable, and people, staff, guards, patients, repeated gestures in impossible sequences. The camp had become a living riddle, a place where nothing could be trusted, and every observation carried a hidden meaning I could not decode. In that growing chaos, I realized the true terror of silent accumulation. It was not loud, not violent, not even immediately perceptible. It was insidious. It gathered slowly, layering subtle wrongness upon subtle wrongness until the world became unrecognizable. And in that world I moved forward with care, with trepidation, knowing that each step, each breath, each gesture was being recorded and subtly altered, as if the camp itself were watching and responding. Rewriting reality in response to my every action. I had become a participant in a sequence of events that could not be understood. Actions and consequences were disentangled. Cause and effect no longer aligned. Memory betrayed me. Perception betrayed me. The camp did not simply exist around me, it existed through me, shaping my experience, manipulating my understanding, and drawing me deeper into its silent, accumulative web. And yet I could not stop. I could not flee. Each duty demanded completion. Each presence demanded engagement. And as I moved through corridors, tended patients, and observed the repeating, impossible events, the camp continued its slow, unrelenting accumulation of disorder. Time bent, objects shifted, people moved without logic, and reality itself seemed to fold around me in patterns I could not decode. In that subtle, pervasive chaos, I understood. This was no accident, no failure of organization, no trick of the mind. The camp had become an organism. It accumulated, it responded, it anticipated. And I, despite my knowledge, my skills, my moral compass, was merely a part of its intricate design, a piece in a system that would not reveal its rules until it had consumed every certainty I had carried with me. The repetition began subtly at first, almost imperceptible. A tray returned to the exact position I had just moved it, a chair aligned precisely where it had been an hour ago, a shadow crossing the floor in the same rhythm, in the same pattern as though some unseen hand had orchestrated it. At first, I told myself it was coincidence, a trick of memory, fatigue, or fear. But the coincidences multiplied until they became undeniable, impossible to ignore. The camp had begun to mirror me, to predict me, to trap me in an unbroken loop of observation and reflection. I walked the corridors, each step measured, each breath calculated, and yet the path I took repeated itself without my choice. I would turn a corner, convinced I was entering new space, only to see the same object, the same shadow, the same door exactly where it had been moments before. And when I retraced my steps, the repetitions persisted, as if the camp were encoding my movements into its structure, recording my presence like a pattern it could not release. Voices began to echo in fragments. I heard conversations before they had occurred, words spoken in reverse or out of sequence, phrases that were incomplete yet charged with meaning I could not grasp. A nurse would whisper a question I had not yet asked. A soldier would comment on an event that had not yet happened. These fragments repeated themselves across space and time, intersecting with my perception in ways I could not anticipate. My mind strained to reconcile them, to find order, but the fragments only multiplied, each repetition layering new confusion upon the last. Objects themselves became untrustworthy. A needle would appear in my hand moments before I had retrieved it from its tray. A clipboard I had set aside would vanish, only to reappear in a location I had never seen. Trays, tools, instruments, they moved not according to any human logic, but according to some internal pattern that observed my actions and responded, subtly, deliberately. Every object in the camp seemed aware of me, aware of my attempts to assert control, and responded with a quiet, unyielding obedience to some hidden rule. I noticed that even the staff were drawn into repetition. A soldier would pass me 3 times in an hour, each pass identical in pace, posture, and expression, though I had taken care to alter my own path. Nurses repeated gestures precisely, movements that seemed rehearsed yet altered just enough to unsettle. Patience. Eyes followed patterns I could not predict, staring at objects or spaces that were empty, anticipating movements I had not yet made. The living had become actors in a performance directed by the camp itself, and I was the unwilling audience and participant. Time more than ever betrayed me. Clocks ticked unevenly. Hours stretched and contracted. Minutes dissolved into seconds that felt eternal. I could not discern whether I had been walking for 10 minutes or 10 hours, whether a conversation had happened before or after an event I had already witnessed. The accumulation of repetition made the concept of causality meaningless. I could no longer trust my memory, my judgment, or the sequence of reality itself. The camp existed not in linear time but in layers, loops, and cycles, all converging on me. I began to fear my own thoughts. Every internal question, every fleeting doubt, every attempt to rationalize the anomalies became part of the pattern. It was as if the camp could read not only my movements but my mind, anticipate my reasoning, and respond accordingly. I would think a step might resolve confusion, and the step itself would be altered before I completed it. I would consider speaking, and the words would shift, rearranged by the silent architecture of the camp before leaving my lips. My own cognition became both tool and trap, weapon and cage. Repetition became maddening. Objects, people, sounds, gestures, all circling back on themselves in ways I could not predict or stop. A tray left in one place returned to me at the precise moment I had first noticed it. A window opened, then closed, then reopened exactly as it had been. A shadow fell across the floor in perfect timing with my steps. Every repetition created anticipation, and anticipation created dread, a closed loop of fear with no exit. I attempted to record my observations, to write them down, to assert control, but the records themselves betrayed me. Notes rearranged, ink shifted, observations appeared incomplete, rewritten as if someone or something had anticipated my attempt to capture reality. My efforts at understanding became futile. The more I tried to document, the more the camp defied comprehension, folding my logic back on itself. The repetitions were not benign. Each recurring detail carried with it a subtle weight, an invisible pressure that accumulated, pressing at the edges of my consciousness. I felt my mind taut, stretched thin, trying to reconcile impossible patterns, trying to anchor myself in a reality that no longer existed. Each moment of recognition, the chair, the tray, the shadow, the phrase, was a small shock, a reminder that nothing was reliable, nothing was permanent, and nothing was within my control. I began to speak less, to act less, to move cautiously through space that no longer obeyed natural laws. Even simple gestures, handing a tray, closing a door, adjusting a sheet, became decisions fraught with uncertainty. Every action was mirrored, repeated, or preempted by the camp, leaving me in a perpetual state of disorientation. The repetition was a lock, and I was the prisoner, the key, and the witness simultaneously. The psychological pressure was relentless. I could feel the camp observing, responding, anticipating. My sense of time dissolved entirely. Hours, minutes, seconds became meaningless. Events occurred before they had occurred, objects moved independently, voices repeated across space and time. My own mind became a labyrinth, and I wandered its corridors just as the camp wandered mine. And yet I could not leave, I could not retreat. The accumulation of repetition demanded attention. Every step, every breath, every glance was both observed and manipulated. I was part of the system, and the system was part of me. There was no outside. There was no escape. Only repetition. Only observation. Only the quiet, inexorable folding of reality around a single point, me. It was in this locked, repetitive space that I understood the camp's final cruelty. It was not overt. It was not physical. It was a psychological labyrinth, a perfect machine that distorted perception, erased causality, and trapped the mind in cycles of anticipation and dread. Every action, every thought, every perception was a component of the pattern, and I had become both subject and instrument. I was observed, altered, and ensnared in a silent lock with no key. And still the camp did not speak, did not strike, did not acknowledge. It only was, and I moved through it, caught in cycles I could neither begin nor end, caught in repetitions that reflected my own fear, my own hesitation, my own unraveling. Every corridor, every shadow, every repeated gesture built a tension that could not release. Every day became a mirror of the last, yet subtly different, feeding a growing anxiety I could not name. I realized that the horror of this phase was not destruction. It was the impossibility of comprehension, the inability to break free, the psychological lock of reality itself bending around my presence. I felt the edges of sanity fray. The camp folded, twisted, mirrored, repeated. I moved through cycles I could not measure, sequences I could not track, repetitions I could not escape. And in this space, I was alone, yet surrounded, erased, yet present, trapped in a psychological lock crafted with perfect patience, precise intention, and total silence. The change did not arrive all at once. It came quietly, delayed, as if the camp itself needed time to decide what to keep and what to remove. At first, nothing appeared wrong. The gates opened at the same hours. The guards stood in the same places. The routines continued, precise and orderly. But something fundamental was missing. I noticed it when I reached for a file that should have been there. The drawer opened smoothly. The folders were aligned. But the space where the record belonged was empty. Not torn out. Not crossed through. Simply gone. I told myself it was an error. Misfiling. Clerical confusion. Something ordinary. But the absence repeated itself. Names I remembered clearly no longer appeared in logs. Entries I had written no longer existed. Dates skipped forward without explanation. Entire days reduced to blank space. When I asked about it, no one reacted. No confusion. No surprise. Only brief pauses, just long enough to signal recognition, then silence. The staff moved differently now. Not fearful. Not anxious. Careful. They avoided certain corridors without discussing why. They skipped over specific beds as if they had never existed. They spoke freely about trivial matters, yet fell silent when a particular memory drifted too close. It was not denial. It was discipline. The hospital still functioned, but it felt hollow, like a body continuing to move after something essential had been removed. Equipment was cleaned. Beds were made. Procedures were followed. But the atmosphere was altered permanently. Some rooms were no longer used. Doors remained locked without signage. Lights stayed off even during working hours. No one explained the change. No one questioned it. I began to understand that what had happened was not meant to be punished. It was meant to be forgotten. The consequences were not visible wounds or dramatic aftermath. They were absences, carefully maintained gaps. People who once occupied space now existed only in my memory. And even memory felt dangerous. I noticed how others avoided recalling too much. How sentences were reshaped mid-thought. How stories ended before reaching critical moments. Survivors learned quickly what not to say. Not through threats. Through observation. Silence had become policy. The records reflected this perfectly. There were no errors. No inconsistencies. Only clean pages that told an incomplete truth. History had not been rewritten. It had been edited. What disturbed me most was how effective it was. Without names, events lost weight. Without documentation, questions lost urgency. Without witnesses willing to speak, reality became negotiable. Even I began to hesitate. I caught myself pausing before remembering. Before connecting events. Before acknowledging patterns I knew were real. The system did not need force anymore. It had achieved something far more durable. Compliance. The camp no longer felt hostile. It felt settled. And that was the most unsettling consequence of all. What remained was a place that functioned smoothly, efficiently, and quietly. A place where something terrible had happened, and then been absorbed so completely that it left no visible scar. No justice followed. No investigation arrived. No explanation was offered. Only continuation. And I realized then that erasure was not an afterthought. It was the final stage. Not to destroy evidence violently, but to make it unnecessary. To train people not to look. Not to ask. Not to remember. The camp did not need secrecy anymore. It had achieved something far more effective: acceptance without understanding. And once that took hold, the consequences no longer belonged to the past. They became permanent. She walked slowly through the empty corridors, each step echoing against walls that had seen everything and said nothing. The wards were quiet, the beds made, the instruments untouched. Shadows stretched long across the floor, folding over themselves like memories that refused to leave. Some places don't destroy people, they erase them. Her hands trembled slightly, though no one could see. The faces she had tended, the names she remembered, they existed only in her mind now. Outside, the camp continued as it always had, indifferent to the passage of those it had shaped and silenced. Every corner, every hallway, every silent figure remained, functioning, observing, unchanged. Responsibility without blame, silence without reason. That was the order here. And though she had followed, obeyed, and endured, the outcome was neither justice nor punishment. It was absence. It was erasure. It was a reality carefully structured to remove not the facts, but the awareness of them. She stepped through the gates as dusk fell, the sky darkening in muted reds and grays. The light caught the barbed wire, the stone walls, the distant figures moving in quiet rhythm. And yet nothing seemed different. The camp did not bend. It did not pause. It did not acknowledge her departure. It simply existed, and in existing, it altered everything that had passed through it. War is not chaos. It is structure. Orders do not need to be questioned because the system itself enforces obedience, memory, and forgetting. And some orders should never be questioned. Her footsteps faded into the growing dusk. The silence of the camp swallowed her presence, leaving only the echo of absence behind. Questions lingered in the air: why certain events had occurred, why certain people were gone, why the rules had been so precise, and no answer would ever arrive. The camp did not answer. It did not judge. It only was. And in that quiet, haunting stillness, the story remained unresolved. Forever incomplete.